It's June 4th, 1919, and I'm reading the newspaper in my kitchen while eating a biscuit and drinking a cup of hot, steamy tea. My name is Ivy Carter. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. If you can guess what I just read about, I'll be amazed. I read that the 19th Amendment has just been passed by the United States Congress. Let me tell you about the amendment. The 19th Amendment states that the United States provides men and women with equal opportunities, which include voting rights. Congress just took a vote, and now it has to be ratified by 36 different states before it becomes a law. I remember being a very little girl attending the Seneca Falls Convention. I'm 78 years old now, but I still remember almost every detail. Thanks to the Seneca Falls Convention, some states allow women to vote. It was held on July 19th and 20th in 1848. It was the first women's rights convention. It took place in New York. Over 300 people attended the event. I remember hearing Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton speak. Lucretia Mott was an abolitionist, a Quaker, social reformer, and women's rights activist. The reason we had the Seneca Falls Convention was for the social, civil, and religious rights for women. Social, which is the right to own property. Civil, the right to vote, and religious rights, being able to follow your own beliefs. I also saw Frederick Douglass. He was the only African American male who attended the convention. Women had no right to vote, to have proper education, no property ownership, and no child custody. I hope all of that will change soon. 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration states all men and women are created equal. Aaron Sargent was a strong advocate of women's suffrage. He introduced the 19th Amendment. He was a senator from California. In 1887, the amendment was voted on and rejected by the Senate. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton met many years before the convention at an anti-slavery convention, but were not allowed in the anti-slavery convention because of their gender, and women weren't supposed to come. They were supposed to stay home and do housework, cook, and take care of the children at home. I'm hopeful that we will reach 36 states while I'm still living. I also hope that we will ratify this amendment in no time. I'm hopeful that you believe in women's rights and that you enjoyed my story. Overall, I think that there are many important people that we should give thanks to for helping to make the 19th Amendment happen.
Ladies and gentlemen of Bristol, I have just arrived on the 3:35 afternoon train from Nashville to your beautiful train station. Today is August the 10th, 1920, and our country is abuzz with the talk of the proposed 19th Amendment. I am here to report to you that just yesterday, August the 9th, Governor Roberts has convened a special session of the Tennessee legislature to take up the question of ratification of that amendment. We are on the brink of a momentous and exciting occasion. In this year of 1920, women under the law face certain disabilities. We, in most states, are not allowed to vote in local, state, or federal elections. We cannot run for or hold public office. We cannot serve on jury duty. If this amendment should be ratified, every woman in the United States, we could vote in our very first presidential election in November of 1920. The word suffrage is a noun which means the right to vote in political elections. The first major gathering for women's suffrage was in 1848, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, 300 others, 40 of which were men, met in Seneca Falls, New York, to draw up the first American public protest against the political, economic, and social inequalities of women. The document from this meeting they call the Declaration of Sentiments. It was based on the language of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. The meeting in Seneca Falls passed a dozen resolutions demanding equal rights for women in marriage, education, religion, and employment. Elizabeth Stanton shocked the convention with one additional resolution: that women secure for themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. She was incensed by the fact that not only men of quality, but all men could vote. Elizabeth said, and I quote, "Had it been reserved for men of stature like Webster, Clay, or Van Buren, women might not complain. But to have drunkards, idiots, horse racing, rum-selling rowdies, ignorant foreigners, and silly boys fully recognized, while we ourselves are thrust out from all the rights that belong to citizens, it is too grossly insulting to the dignity of women to be longer quietly submitted to. The right is ours. Have it we must, use it we will," unquote. She and the other women had few illusions about the difficult road ahead. She said, "We do not expect our path to be strewn with the flowers of popular applause, but over the thorns of bigotry and prejudice will be our way." How true her words were. Susan B. Anthony, a member of a Massachusetts Quaker family, joined the cause in 1851. She became a close friend of Elizabeth Stanton. There is a 7-ton marble sculpture which pays tribute to the founders of the women's suffrage movement, Elizabeth, Susan, and Lucretia. This monument was a gift to Congress in 1921 by Alice Paul's National Party movement. Congress half-heartedly accepted the sculpture and put it in the basement of the Capitol for the next 7 decades. On Mother's Day weekend, 1997, it was moved to the rotunda. If you look closely, you will see rising behind the 3 women's heads a vague, uncarved block of marble. Rumor has it that this uncarved block of marble is for our first woman president. Please absorb this date, 1848. Today is 1920. It has been a 72-year struggle for women's voting rights. It is one of the great stories of American democracy, and one we hear little about. In 100 years, I wonder, will anyone remember? Many women gave their entire life or constant interest to the cause. Young suffragists today were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links are dead. Throughout the 1850s, Numerous national women's rights conventions and meetings were held, making it a strong movement. With the outbreak of the Civil War, women suspended their activities on their own behalf and devoted energies to the noble purpose of freeing the slaves. After the passage of the 13th Amendment prohibiting slavery, there was talk of combining the issue of suffrage for blacks and women, but the public was not ready for both of these issues. The 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, represented a serious setback in the cause of women's rights. The amendment included the first use of the word male in the Constitution. On the morning of the first Tuesday in November in 1872 in Rochester, New York, Susan Anthony calmly walked into the polling place, broke the law by dropping a paper ballot into the wooden box. She wrote to Elizabeth, "Well, I've been, gone, and done it." Anthony was experimenting with a new legal strategy of the 14th Amendment, which in the first section of the amendment states that native-born or naturalized persons as American citizens must enjoy certain privileges. Susan said, "I am a citizen." But the amendment continues in Section 2 to declare that any state that denies the right to vote to any male citizen 21 years of age could be penalized. It was a nervy interpretation on her part. Susan was arrested by the U.S. Marshal and charged with illegal voting as she wanted to be. She asked to be handcuffed and taken to jail, but her lawyer paid her $500 bail. Undaunted, while she awaited a trial, she made 50 speeches everywhere proclaiming, "I am a citizen." Her trial in the U.S. District Court was a sensation, covered daily by the national press, just as she wanted. Her sentence was a $100 fine with court costs and the threat of jail. She was never jailed, never paid the fine, and there was no attempt to collect it. Anthony was most disappointed that she was unable to pursue her case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Susan and Elizabeth soon realized that speeches were not making the impact that they wanted. They now turned to draft a new amendment and boiled it down to a single sentence. "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." They found a champion in Senator Aaron Sargent of California, who introduced the amendment to the U.S. Senate in January of 1878. It sat in Congress for the next 40 years. It was reintroduced into every succeeding Congress 21 times, but quickly disappeared into committees. During this period, many bold and passionate women dedicated their lives to the suffrage movement. Some of the effective leaders were Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, and Frankie Pierce. Carrie Chapman Catt was anointed by Susan B. Anthony as the next leader of the suffrage movement. Alice Paul was a Quaker from New Jersey, a descendant of William Penn. Frankie Pierce, an African-American woman born in Nashville, called not only for gender equality, but racial equality. Major national and international organizations came on the scene. In 1858, the YWCA was founded to protect and support women's issues, including the suffrage movement and labor laws affecting women and children. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded to combat the influence of alcohol on families and society. At the same time, there were powerful forces who mobilized against the women's suffrage. We see the picture of the headquarters for opposition. The manufacturing industry and railroads feared the influence of women voters on the labor laws, and the liquor industry feared women voters would advance the causes of the temperance unions. A poster which announces, "Mass meeting at the Ryman Auditorium to save the South from the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because of the threat of pressure on Southern states to allow Black women and men to vote." On the other hand, massive suffrage parades were held in all the states, with women dressed in flowing white dresses with yellow banners. It should be noted that the suffrage movement was entangled with the racial sentiments of the day, especially in the South. Black women fought for the right to vote while facing discrimination from white suffragists who did not want their movement associated with women of color. Black women felt that they faced the double burden of Blackness and womanhood. Painfully, women, Black and white, all struggled to gain the right to vote. In 1917, Woodrow Wilson, then president, would not endorse the women's suffrage movement. Alice Paul believed that by picketing the White House, it would embarrass President Wilson. War had been declared against Germany. The suffragists stationed themselves 6 days a week, rain or shine, with banners and placards that called President Wilson Kaiser Wilson, burned him in effigy, and held signs stating that there was no real democracy in the United States. These women were arrested for obstructing the sidewalk, convicted and sentenced to up to 6 months at the Occoquan Workhouse in southern Fairfax County, Virginia, just outside the nation's capital. Many of the women were beaten, kicked, choked, stripped naked, chained to the bars of a cell, and force-fed until they became ill. This became known as the Night of Terror. President Wilson did get the message, and finally, he came out in favor of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, January of 1918. He said in a speech to Congress that the world is watching us. Women are vital to the war effort and vital to peace. Ladies and gentlemen, you may have read in your newspaper just a year ago, June the 4th, 1919, that the 66th Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, but there was no reason to celebrate yet. It was now in the hands of the 48 states that a required ratification be won in 3/4 of those states. The suffragists had to win no fewer than 36 states, and the well-entrenched antis could kill the amendment with just 13 legislatures. Why cynics are predicting it might take another 20 years, and we are hoping to vote in our first presidential election in November of 1920. Why women could vote in 26 other countries. We are in the great Commonwealth of Virginia, but Virginia, like all southern states, does not favor women's suffrage. As time moves on in the spring and summer of 1920, it has become clear that there are 35 sure states that will ratify this amendment. But where is that 36th state? It seems that the choice might be Delaware. After all, in 1787, Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution. But ratification lost just this past June in Delaware. All attention now turns to Tennessee, in particular Nashville, in this hot summer of 1920. What a twist of fate. The southern state of Tennessee is the last hope of ratification of the 19th Amendment. While traveling on the train today, I met Mr. and Mrs. John Vertrees from Nashville. Mr. Vertrees is a prominent lawyer in Nashville, and he asked that he might present a few of his thoughts today. Mr. Vertrees, welcome.
Thank you, Mrs. Arnold, and good evening. I am John Vertrees, and I appreciate the opportunity for speaking with you this evening. I am an attorney in Nashville, Tennessee. My law practice has provided me with the opportunity to be involved in government matters and issues of the day. I take some pride in sharing with you that I am a personal friend of former President William Howard Taft, who offered to name me as governor of the Philippines, a position he once held. For various reasons, I declined. He also once considered appointing me to the Supreme Court, but circumstances led him in a different direction. Incidentally, President Taft is the only person who has ever held both offices of President of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I have taken a particular interest in the suffrage issue. I have clients who have watched this misguided movement for years, and I have strong personal feelings on this as well. Indeed, my wife has served as president of the Tennessee branch of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. And incidentally, Mrs. Vertrees sends her regrets for not being in attendance here tonight. She is somewhat under the weather. 4 years ago, in 1916, I wrote a manifesto addressed to the men of the state of Tennessee. And I would like to share with you some of those comments that I made in that document. I do not believe that the women of Tennessee want the ballot. But even if they do, the question which men must determine is not affected in the least. It is not a question of what women want, but what they ought to have. And as men only now vote, it is a question for men alone to determine. Beyond that, I hold the belief that if you do not take up arms to defend this country, you should not be entitled to vote. Further, we all know that women have certain biological and emotional...
Oh, Mr. Vertrees, enough of this nonsense. Please sit down. We have important things to discuss.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Arnold. You have made my point more eloquently than I possibly could in 1,000 words.
Oh, Mr. Vertrees, you would be emotional too if you had been treated as a second-class citizen. Please pass along my sympathies to Mrs. Vertrees. I certainly understand why she is ill. I do apologize for that untimely distraction. As I mentioned earlier, Governor Roberts of Tennessee has convened a special session for the all-male, all-white, good old boy legislature. The session will meet for 3 weeks to defend, denounce, discuss, and finally to vote upon the ratification of the so-called Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Thousands of pro and anti-suffragist activists have descended upon Nashville. Weeks of intense lobbying will take place within the Tennessee legislature. This session is a special boom to the Nashville florist as large welcoming parties of women pounce upon these visitors and try to pin a rose on their lapel. You see, this is called the War of the Roses. The red rose for the antis and the yellow rose for the suffragists. Yellow had long been the American suffrage color, signifying the flame of freedom's fires. The amendment sailed through the Senate, but stalled in the House. As it happened, not only Tennessee, but East Tennessee played a major role in the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Feb Byrne, a college-educated former teacher, widow, lives on a farm in Nyota, Tennessee. Nyota is located between Chattanooga and Knoxville. Feb is very well read. She reads magazines and 4 newspapers every week. She could not vote, but as she said, her farm workers, many who are illiterate, could go to the polls and vote. She has a young son, Harry, only 24, who has served his first term in the House, being its youngest member. Feb could not even vote for her son. Now, Harry is aligned with the antis. Feb told a reporter that after reading the bitter speeches the antis had made, she said, "I sat down on a little chair on my front porch and I wrote a few lines to my son." Now in Nashville, Harry Byrne ponders his mother's letter. And I quote a few lines from this famous letter. "Dear son, I've been waiting to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Hurrah, and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. Be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. With lots of love, Mama," unquote. Harry was seeking re-election. Was his duty to his constituents back home in McMinn County or to his mother's own ideas? On the morning of August the 18th, 1920, Harry was wearing the red rose of the antis. The huge chamber was hushed as anti-suffragists, in a test of strength, made a motion to table the amendment, which, if passed, would mean its defeat. The vote was taken. It proved a tie, 48-48. Confident that at least another vote would defeat the amendment, the anti-suffragists now called for a vote on the amendment itself. When the clerk, droning the roll call, reached the name of Harry T. Byrne, who had previously voted to table the amendment, there was a moment of hesitation. Then, in a clear voice, Harry called aye. The tie was shattered. Tennessee's ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting 27 million women the right to vote had passed. 8 days later, it became part of the U.S. Constitution. Perhaps all because of a mother's letter to her son. On Market Square in Knoxville, Tennessee, there is a wonderful sculpture of Feb and Harry Byrne. Feb is standing behind Harry, who is seated, her guiding hand on his shoulder and her letter in Harry's hand. There is another interesting story from East Tennessee, in fact, just down the road in Bluff City, Tennessee. James Parks Worley and Charles Worley Sr. were brothers. They owned the Bluff City Mills. Parks had been elected to the Senate for 4 terms and previously served in the House. He was greatly respected, along with his lovely wife, Anna Lee Keyes Worley. Senator Worley was not for women's suffrage. He said he represented the women who stayed at home and tended to their wifely and motherly duties. Anna supported her husband's belief. In January of 1921, Senator and Mrs. Worley were in Nashville, staying at the Hermitage Hotel, when he became ill and died. Anna, of course, was in shock. His body was returned to Bluff City, and a large delegation of senators and the governor attended his funeral at the First Methodist Church in Bluff City. Anna was so grief-stricken, she could not attend his funeral. But sometime in the next 13 days, the governor persuaded Anna to run for her husband's unexpired term of office. Another twist of fate. Senator and Mrs. Worley were against the 19th Amendment, which had just passed in the few months ago on August the 18th, 1920. Now, in February of 1921, Anna was elected by the voters of Sullivan and Hawkins County as the first woman to serve in the Tennessee legislature and also the first female state senator in the South. Although she had publicly opposed women's suffrage, after her election to the Senate, she came under the influence of the state's professional women, and Anna sponsored landmark legislation which removed disabilities from women. The act which she sponsored made women eligible to hold any public office in Tennessee, opening the door for 5 women to be elected to the state legislature in 1927. Senator Anna Worley said in a speech that she felt like a person during her tenure in the Senate. There is another sculpture in Knoxville, Tennessee, on Market Square that I want to call your attention to. It is called the Tennessee Women's Suffrage Memorial, a life-size bronze statue featuring the Tennessee suffragists, 3 of them, from Knoxville, Nashville, and Memphis. It is the inscription on that statue that I want to read to you. The young women of today, free to study, to speak, to write, to choose their occupation, should remember that every inch of this freedom was bought for them at a great price. The debt that each generation owes to the past, it must pay to the future. Abigail Scott Dunway. Thank you for your time. I hope we will never forget the long struggle for women's rights and specifically the right to vote. And may we never forget the importance of a single vote and the significance of a mother's influence on her son. Thank you.